Thank you. Donc, hello, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this panel number 10, State, Market, and Migration from a Polanyian perspective. It's part 2. There was the first part a few days ago. My name is Shedli Belkodja. I'm a professor at Concordia University School of Community and Public Affairs. Permettez-moi d'abord de commencer par reconnaître que l'Université Concordia est située en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Nous reconnaissons la nation Gaga comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Montréal est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone diversifiée ainsi que d'autres peuples. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes de la communauté montréalaise. So we have a great panel today. We have 4 presentations. We have, in order, we will start with Noémi Katona from the Hungarian Academy of Science, Hungary. The title of her presentation, Pearls and Heroines from the East, Transnational Care Migration in Europe as an Unequal Exchange. Then we will hear from Petra, Ezzeddine, and Zuzana Uhde from, respectively, Charles University, Czech Republic, and the Czech Academy of Science. The title of the presentation, Care Corridors in Central Europe, the Political Economy Behind a European Care Border Regime. We will then hear Dóra Gábriel from the Hungarian Demographic Research Institute. The title of her presentation, Coping with Care Scarcity and Institutional Deficiency in Rural Hungary. And finally, we will hear from Attila Melegh, Director of the Karl Polanyi Research Center for Global Social Studies, Corvinus University. And the title of the presentation, From Socialist Mixed Economies to a Market Utopia, the Rise of Anti-Immigration Populism. So we have 90 minutes. We will take the 4 presentations in order, 15 minutes each, and then we will have, I hope, a very rich discussion period. You are welcome to leave questions in the Q&A, and we will manage this. So we will start with the first presentation from Noémi.
Hello and welcome to everyone. I will start sharing my screen in a second. Yeah, so the title of my presentation is Pearls and Heroines from the East, Transnational Care Migration in Europe as an Unequal Exchange. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen how heavily elderly care systems in Europe, especially in Western European member states, rely on migrant labor. German news have reported last year about the panic that Polish care workers would return to Poland or stop providing care for the German elderly, which would actually result in the collapse of the entire elderly care system in Germany. They have been calling out for solidarity of the care workers, and actually this discourse of solidarity and calling Central Eastern European care workers pearls and heroines sacrificing themselves did not start with the pandemic. It's actually a continuation, or it's a new form of this discourse, what we see during the pandemic. And these euphemistic narratives of pearls and heroines actually obscures the low payment, the commonly exploitative working conditions, and in many cases, the lack of access to labor rights of these care workers. Furthermore, this political discourse also contributes to the lack of systemic change, and also highlight how the benefiting countries, the receiving states, are predominant in framing the discourse of elderly care, which actually relies on regional socioeconomic inequalities and a lot of tensions within this system. So in my presentation, which actually is built on the book we published last year and edited together with Attila Melegh, called Towards a Scarcity of Care, Tensions and Contradictions in Transnational Elderly Care System in Central and Eastern Europe. We were happy to have actually all panelists in this, or all contributors in this panel as authors of the volume. And also this presentation I'm giving now hopefully will serve as a kind of introduction to the topic of the panel. about generally democratization of care and how it happens in the European landscape. So in the beginning, I will reflect on what is this democratization we see, and I will also look at how Polanyi's ideas, Polanyi's thoughts about fictitious commodification might be useful or are used and referred to today when addressing the care crisis today. Secondly, I will briefly talk about like what do we see in Europe. So what is, if we talk about care crisis or scarcity of care, what's happening and why, and how does it look like now? And finally, I will talk about the role of the state and what is the state doing, and also how the state and market relations change or evolve in this situation. So as Polanyi said, land, labor, and money are the fundamental basis of social life, which were not produced for sale. But actually, if these are for sale, it also deeply undermines the society in generally, because these are basically the very basis of the social life, which also enable production at all. And his ideas and his criticism on the evolving self-regulating market and that in capitalism, society is subordinated to the market and market logic is also what these are really insightful thoughts and provide a great analytical framework for what we see today with the evolving neoliberalism and neoliberal states. And his ideas have been very influential and used also for neoliberalism critical scholars since the 1980s and also nowadays, and also for feminist scholars looking at the commodification of care work and also the reproductive work gender and the commodification of social reproduction. The commodification of reproductive work, including care work, is also of particular nature, particular kind of labor, and the commodification of it also has particular consequences, meaning that this includes kind of work which helps or like enables the social reproduction of the society on an everyday level and also on the long term. And this commodification means actually that also market and market relations enter into very intimate spheres of human life, into the fulfilling of very basic emotional and physical needs. So Nancy Fraser was one of the probably most important scholars addressing it, and she also showed or used Polanyi's framework analyzing today's crisis, basically saying that so like due to the increased marketization, there are enormous inequalities who and how has access to care, and who and under what conditions can provide care, and claim that basically no society that fully marketizes social reproduction can endure long, but we are heading towards this today. She also highlighted that Polanyi's framework and Polanyi's ideas of looking at the social crisis together with financial and ecological crisis is also very a useful analysis to understand today's crisis situation. So what do we see in Europe? So how does the European landscape look like? We see everywhere in Europe, in all European countries, a serious demographic change and increasing demographic aging. And the ratio of the 65-plus-year-old people and the 80-plus-year-old people is enormously increasing, which also means that the number of years spent in vulnerable or severe bad health conditions has also increased, and also the need for care. But at the same time, we see that state services and the social expenditure of states is not following this kind of tendencies, but it's rather stagnating. And in some cases, for example, in the case of Hungary or Czech Republic, it's even declining. So there is an enormous social pressure on states to provide care, but these are not responding to it. It also manifested an example like in Hungary that there are years long, people wait for years to get into publicly financed elderly care homes. So in many cases, they die before getting the eligible or the feasible service they need. Another important historical change what we see, and which also really affects the fulfillment of care needs, is the changes of the role of the family in providing care. Hobsbawm has explained and analyzed the decline of family economies and the collapse of family-based rural systems, and also how basically the institution of the family and the possibilities of the family for caring the elderly has really crucially changed. It is also especially affects the rural areas where we see also massive out-migration, and also due to the increasing migration, the access or the potentials of the family to care for the family members has also enormously changed. So since state and families and also communities play less role in providing care services, it goes hand in hand, or it results in an increasing marketization. So market services are more and more prevailing in providing care. However, this marketization also means, on the one hand, like enormous inequalities, not only between households, that those have access to marketized services. You have the money, you have the financial resources to pay for it. But it means also inequalities on a transnational level, because care services, and the live-in care services, are a prevailing form of providing care. It's mostly conducted or mostly pursued by migrant labor, migrant women's labor in most cases. So we see a transnational division of labor in providing care, and also like the migration of caregivers from Eastern to Western European states, which can be also called a care drain. It's called quite often in the literature as a form of care drain, since the professional, formal care providers migrate from Eastern to Western countries, but also their care potentials and informal carers is also shifted or moved to Western European countries. So as I said, the live-in care arrangement is a prevailing form of which has been also established legally in many Western European states. But this form of care arrangement, or this kind of job or kind of work, entails various risks, and also commonly a lack or violation of labor rights of these care workers, who are in most of the cases migrant women, as tendentially migrant care workers are at the bottom of the hierarchy in the care sector. So they most often take the lower paid jobs and the more riskier working conditions. These risks come from the isolated working condition of very dependent relationships on the employers, the employing families, on the employing caregivers, and also in many cases lack of information and lack of supporting groups and networks. So as I said, there are different regulations in Western European member states that are basically enabling or legalizing this form. This kind of shift, or this kind of process that this form of labor is getting more legally regulated. It's also what we see in the recent decades. It's also rather new phenomenon. And these intend to be protective measures for care workers, since their rights and their work is recognized and is established. But in many ways, the exploitative working conditions remain, although these are legally regulated. So despite the legal compliance, we see that in many ways there are still low payment and still vulnerable working conditions. And the achievement that the work is at least legally recognized is also the effect or the result of different counter movements in Polanyi's terms that achieved this kind of legal recognition. So the work of several self-organizations, NGOs working in this field, or trade unions who have been claiming for more rights for care workers, is one probably most important step or milestone in this process of working for better labor rights is the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers from 2011, which we can see as a counter movement, but at the same time, the achieved legal regulations provided by the Western European member states, as I said, actually still follow the market logic. So they do not challenge the market relations in a way that radically changing the situation of the workers, radically changing the role of the state in providing care in this whole landscape. It's more like the state is being subordinated to the market relations and following the market logic. And also very importantly, this this regulation in the Western member states are also following the benefits or the interest of these Western European member states. So actually what we see on the EU level, that also EU institutions support this kind of unequal exchange between the Western and Eastern European member states. By unequal exchange, I mean to have relations, to have social and economic relations between two regions, when one side, in this case the Central Eastern European member states, suffer from losing income, care capacity and social security payments. So you have a negative balance on the long run. And however, so in that sense, it kind of violates or doesn't follow the interest of the sending states. The issue of care migration and care drain is not addressed adequately in these sending countries. It's rather obscured by demographic nationalism, and also the care tasks are rather pushed to families in these cases, as also as Kamil Matuszczyk explained in his chapter in the volume I have mentioned. So all in all, in this presentation, I try to briefly summarize the causes, effects, and the process of the increasing marketization of the elderly care sector in Europe by highlighting the regional and transnational inequalities it is built on, and that is can be explained as an unequal exchange. And also in this short presentation, I will not provide solutions how to overcome the care crisis. It's a lot bigger, but like I just wanted to highlight again that it's part of a more broader crisis connected with social, ecological, and financial crisis. So in order to change and make a long-term change in the situation, we need a systemic change, not only a better regulation of the care market. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Noémi. So we will now hear from Petra and Zuzana.
Good morning or afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you for organizing this panel. We will share the presentation with my colleague Petra Ezzeddine, but I'm going to start and I will start sharing our screen. Okay, so we will actually follow what Noémi was presenting. Our chapter with Petra Ezzeddine was also part of the book, which she mentioned. And in this paper, we will present some theses on the political economy of translocal social reproduction in the EU and the everyday power of borders which coexist with the narrative of a borderless Europe. Our arguments are based on the research of cross-border care mobilities, which we have conducted, me and Petra, over the past several years. We suggest to shift the research focus away from the level of nation states' welfare policies, which is still prevalent in the research, and also real politics, and to shift it towards transnational, in this case EU, or translocal level, in this case Central Europe. In the presentation, we will first present our theoretical arguments, and in the second part, Petra will illustrate them on the case of cross-border care migration on the Czech borders, especially during the pandemic. We suggest that this shift sheds a clear light on how market-based care provision in the EU is openly built on nationalist justification, which gives priority to the interest of older citizens and their families at the expense of migrant care workers. The inclusion in the care labor market is conditioned by their status as second-class people, which is used to create an illusion of sustainable market-based care arrangements in wealthier countries. The anti-pandemic restrictions and closing of borders have exposed how states depend on and at the same time deny migrants' transnational lives. However, we suggest that it has not created new problems, but rather exposed contradictions of translocal social reproduction already present there before. Regional inequalities in the EU reproduce a distinct European care border regime, which creates the structural position of the low-paid migrant care worker who often come from Central and Eastern EU member states. So it is built on formalized paths for a subtle combination of inclusion through open borders within the EU in the Schengen zone and exclusion from some labor rights protection and social rights entitlements. Countries receiving migrant care workers have built institutionalized mechanisms for use of cheap care labor, which, despite several EU unifying measures, such as in healthcare or retirement entitlements, systematically neglect migrant care workers' transnational lives and deny them equal rights. The Czech Republic is positioned between the two ends of the transnational political economy of social reproduction, which depends to a significant degree on migrant work. Here I will pass the word to Petra.
Hello, everyone. So Zuzana just has mentioned that Czech Republic is positioned in between two ends of this specific system of social reproduction and inequalities in the European Union. So it's a really interesting case because Czech women, they migrate as care workers and live in service, for example, to Germany, Austria, or Netherlands. But also we are receiving care workers mostly from Ukraine. And I have to mention here that both with the Austria and with the Ukraine, we have common political history, and Zuzana touched upon this topic, and she will perhaps a little bit touch it later. And also what is really interesting is a new phenomena of relocation of German seniors to Central and Eastern European elderly facilities. For example, I can give you a case from our ethnographic research. We have found a senior facility which is located 1 kilometer far away from German borders in Czech Republic. But you cannot find Czech caregivers there taking care of German seniors, but here there are Ukrainian and Moldavian women who are providing care. So it's really atypically typical case of paradoxes of regional inequalities.
Let me continue. So I will share some slides showing the economic inequalities in the EU. The geopolitical changes after 1989 partially legitimized a gradual dismantling of public care services, such as childcare facilities, but also residential elder care, and prioritizing cash for care benefits intended for the direct purchasing of care at the market. The overall neoliberal trend towards marketization of care and turning away from socializing care went hand in hand with changing political borders in Europe, especially through EU enlargements. The resulting transnational marketized care sector, where elder care is increasingly performed as a low-wage job by migrant women, is delivering care affordable to those in need of care, however, only at the expense of those who provide care. In late capitalist societies, we are experiencing changes in the forms of paid work. Increasingly more and more care activities have become paid jobs, blurring the line between production and reproduction. At the same time, the conflict between capital and labor has intensified, bringing to the fore a Polanyian understanding of the capitalist market economy as disembedded from the social fabric. In the wake of the extensive enlargement of capitalism, characterized by geopolitical expansion of a capitalist system worldwide, William Robinson argues that in the transnational economy, an intensive enlargement of capitalism, that is the marketization and commodification of areas of social life that were previously excluded from the market relations, including care provision, has become a more prominent strategy of profit accumulation. Although not all care workers are necessarily migrants, the growing number of migrant care workers in the care sector strengthens the connection between care work, precarization, low wages, and marginalization. And a naturalized idea of borders, which coexists with the idea of open borders, is instrumental for reproducing undervaluation of care in the global capitalism. The supply of cheap migrant care labor postpones, in fact, the crisis of care in wealthier countries, which blocks then the potential for the double movement. There is a demand for public care provision and a collective responsibility for social reproduction. The political economy of social reproduction in the global capitalism requires enforcement of borders, but it also requires the selective opening which mediates a production of a marginalized labor force for care markets. Open borders alone are not a solution. they still function as borders. Open borders within the EU Schengen zone without deep structural changes in the political economy of social reproduction and valuation of care, in fact, reproduce and reinforce existing gendered and nationality-based vulnerabilities and the subordinate inclusion of marginalized migrants as disposable cheap labor. The European cross-border care market, in fact, sheds a light on how the idea of freedom of borders, or freedom of movement, if it is defined within neoliberal political economy, is used to exploiting the mobility of circular migrants, pushing down wages in care work, and promote what we call distorted emancipation, in which, in fact, the emancipation of some groups of women depends on the structures of global inequalities and is conditioned by gender and social injustices for other groups to whom the care and reproductive work is outsourced. As a result, what is being promoted as women's emancipation, in fact, reproduce traditional gender division of labor, in which most men do not participate in care provision and care remains private, hence again blocking the double movement. The cross-border care labor markets is often portrayed as a win-win model in which the older people and families with small children receive affordable and quality care or domestic services, and migrant women have a paid job which still pays more than alternatives at home. But in fact, it creates a legal scheme of nationality-based structural inequalities and exclusion amidst a myth of egalitarian and integrated Europe without borders. It is borders which keep the marketization of care viable. Borders are open for people to cross as if they do not exist, but regional inequalities, economic inequalities keep in space the everyday power that borders have to categorize people and through which the wealthier countries benefit at the expense of poorer ones. I will give the word to Petra now.
Zuzana just has mentioned how open borders, or the myth of open borders is important for functioning of this specific system of the cross-border care regime. So if Zuzana, please, could you move with the slide to the next slide? I see the previous one, sorry. I have kind of technical problems, so we have to go through it alone. I see the previous one. Something is wrong here. I had an unstable internet connection. It was written here, so it was blocked perhaps. So but I can add it to your comment. Sorry, I don't see it.
I don't know what you were planning to.
Okay, could you just read it and I can add it to this, please? Sorry, I don't see slides.
So the pandemic actually exposed the more general dynamic. And what was happening at the beginning, the Czech Republic closed the borders and it actually opened up political discussion. Suddenly the care migration or circular migration became very topical issue discussed at the level of ministries. But the paradox of this closing of borders actually is that the care migration from the Czech Republic is growing because it is essential work which then provide still the opportunities for an income for women who lost their jobs during the pandemic, but at the same time, as essential, it is still deeply exploitative and vulnerable position.
If I can add here on that slide, perhaps you see, and I'm not seeing it, I just added the impact of the closure of the borders on the lives of caregivers, how they were deeply affected because they are working in specific rotation cycle of 2 weeks shifts. So there are 2 weeks in Germany and 2 weeks back home. So this is somehow promoted that it's ideal for them to balance productive and reproductive work so they can earn money in Germany and then to be.
We've lost her connection.
I think we lost Petra's connection.
Yeah, so maybe we could move on.
So just here are some pictures from the borders. So as
now, but I just put some pictures there, pictures of a face mask, which now I see the slides are moving. I see them, sorry. So we saw face masks. This is the symbol of pendlers, which they try to use it in order to differentiate from others who cross the borders, because they had to go through the strict regime of quarantining themselves for 14 days. And of course, the 14 days they wanted to use for their unpaid care work for their own families, and they couldn't do it in this sense. And of course, they had to do testing, especially in the spring 2020. Those tests were quite expensive when we compared the price of the tests and their salaries. And other slide, if you can move a little bit, there are strikes on the borders, and women, they try to express their vulnerable position because they really needed those money or remittances for their own families. They wanted also be present in the lives of their families back home. So they try to express their anger towards especially Czech state and also German state. And as I wrote in previous slide, they face really strong social stigmatization in both countries as potential virus contaminators in both communities. So it was really difficult. And it ended that those caregivers, they had to take... Sorry, do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know what was the last, what I said. Sorry, today is quite unstable internet connection, unusual.
We will have to move on. If you could conclude, just to
yeah, I just try to say that that this pandemic situation just open what was already there, and who faced the expenses of the situation on their own shoulders were in fact caregivers. Nobody cared about them, yeah, because they're working in formal care environment in private households, so they were not so exposed as those who work in formal institutions. And as Zuzana said, this cross-border scheme is often really sold as a win-win model, but what we try to argue here, and also what I try to in this complicated way to explain here in this ethnography on the borders, that this is really not functioning. And of course, it's really breaking the myth of egalitarian and integrated European Union. Mm-hmm. So it's all, sorry for the complication, something is wrong here in Prague with the internet.
Sorry, thank you. It's not easy, well.
Yeah, thank you for your attention, and also sorry for that.
No problem. Thank you again. So we will move to the third presentation. So it's Dóra.
Shall I start?
Yes, please start and share, your presentation. Mm-hmm. You have your, voila, we see it.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone. Today I will talk about a paper which is in process. So if you have ideas, I'm happy to hear them. So in this presentation, I will talk about the intersection of local and transnational care work as gendered practice in the life course of migrant care workers from rural Hungary. I argue that the inadequate system of care services, as well as the traditional values and expectations related to care work as female responsibility, can push women to stop working abroad as paid care migrants when care is needed in their family. So in the following, I will focus on the different coping strategies of emerging intrafamiliar care obligations. I will reveal how migrant care workers handle these care needs at home in their localities. I will use the term of micro-mobilities of care, which can bring us closer to the understanding of the daily organization of care. Recently, there are a lot of research on migrant care workers, but there are significantly less research which focus on local care workers. And now I intend to talk about care practices and the perspectives of migrant care workers and their family members. Besides gender care practices, the deficiency of the social care system, and the lack of suitable care services in rural Hungary also contribute to the increased workload of these women. So I try to reconcile the micro and the institutional level and find out how the micro-mobilities of care are displayed in these localities. So first, about just a few data. So in Hungary, the population aged 65 and over is around 20%, which is just slightly lower than in the EU countries in 2020. And we can see similar ratios regarding the old age dependency ratio, which was slightly higher in the EU countries on average. But there are very big differences regarding health and very bad health conditions among the elderly, as we can see in the data. And a few words about the elder care policy in Hungary. So the Hungarian model regarding elder care can be described as familialism by default or unsupported familialism. It means that the state provides low financial support for family care and doesn't provide publicly available alternatives. In Hungary, compared to childcare, elderly care is a low priority in public policy. And I would raise another point, which is, I think, very interesting, that in Hungary, parental care obligation is not only a social norm, but it's also stated in the fundamental law of Hungary. In the 16th article, we can read that adult children shall be obliged to take care of their parents if they are in need. But it's not a very unique thing in Hungary. It appears in other European and non-European countries. For example, we can find this idea in the German civil code, saying that lineal relatives are under an obligation to maintain each other. Basic long-term services in Hungary are provided mostly by the municipalities, financed by the central budget. We can distinguish publicly available social and healthcare services. Social care services contain basic care, such as the social catering, home assistance service, alarm system-based home assistance, daytime care, and also specialized care, such as the residential care. And the healthcare services include nursing care in hospitals or nursing care at home. The survey data show that Hungarian elderly don't count on institutional help, but they rather rely on family members for assistance. As opposed to many EU countries where home-based care is often provided by the migrant care workers, in Hungary, paid living care is either performed by locals or ethnic Hungarians. Migrant care workers arrive from Transylvania or Transcarpathia. They are neighboring countries, and these people, these care workers, are actually culturally Hungarian, and they speak the language. And also local communities have an important role, and of course there is informal paid and unpaid home assistance. And I find it important to mention gender norms as well, because this is a part of the story. So after the Second World War, the Hungarian government took responsibility of labor market integration of less employed social groups, such as women. This state policy became very successful, and during the 4 decades of socialism, the employment rate of women increased significantly, as we can see in the data, compared to men. But the image of the traditional caregiver role of mothers remained and was deepened by the social policies introduced in the early 90s. These policies were, for example, the institution of full-time motherhood or low-paid care allowance, or even the child care allowance. And recent studies reveal that the tension between the paid and unpaid work is especially among women of low income and working class groups is very strong, and these women have limited access to state-provided care services, and they can actually afford to pay for these services on the market. So now I would talk a few words about my empirical research that I conducted in the last few years. It was a qualitative research with several fields, mostly on the southern part of Hungary in Polanyi County, but I also conducted interviews in Austria and Germany as well. These interviews were narrative interviews, and also they had semi-structured interview parts. I analyzed the data with the objective hermeneutics and the method of reconstruction of processes. And also it contained the thematic analysis. I had 45 interviews, mostly with living care workers, but also I tried to reach their partners and other agents and actors in this story. And I find it important to mention the life course perspective in the analysis that will appear very soon in the case studies. So now I would like to show two cases, and I will highlight these points that I mentioned at the beginning. So the first case is about an elderly woman, Marika, who is 63. She is from a Swabian family. She has a demented husband, and she has an elderly mother who is actually in good shape, but she is over 80. Very interesting to see her employment history, because Marika has been working in a factory for almost 40 years. But after she became unemployed, and after 2 years, she decided to go to Austria for migrant care work. It's interesting to see how she starts her story. This is her first narrative. And she says, what's the story? The story is that I lost my job. I didn't get a job here, nowhere. And then I decided to go abroad. Unfortunately, because no one employed me. And then I went abroad for care work. So this is already part of the life course. But when her husband's health condition is at stake, she has to return. And it shouldn't be a problem, but we know that in this household, the gender expectations are very rigid. So she has care responsibilities, but this husband receives care from his daughter, also his mother-in-law, and informal help in the locality from the neighbors. Also, he goes to the hospital, to the psychiatry every month for a few days, where he receives special treatment. But in this small village where they live, there are available public services, and this family knows about these services, but they don't use them because somehow it's in the thinking of the family that care is the responsibility of the woman, so women has to do this work. So this is a very strong expectation. And Marika, yeah, she argues this in several ways, but I brought only one citation, that he is looking for me, searching where I am. I cannot even go to the shop. Then I need to ask my mother to look for him, because he walks away and won't find his way back home. And we also know that this husband thought that Marika was on vacation when he was working in Austria. So we can feel the tension. So here, actually, we can see that the outsourcing of care is not possible. And there is no negotiation in the family. And this situation leads to that the wife becomes an unpaid full-time caregiver. The other case is the case of Luca, where we can see the signs of much more egalitarian setting, but also there are some tensions. So this woman, who is 61, finished practical nursing school, but she also had precarious jobs after getting fired from her relatively stable workplace. She has a visually impaired daughter who is already adult, and she has a partner who is a bus driver. She starts her narrative with these words: "Why did I come here to work? Not because I became unemployed, but because I'm full of debts. And I have a blind daughter who needs more or less help. She won't be able to conduct an independent living. She will always need a crutch." But Zuzana is in a very bad position because she works far from her family, from her town, and she can visit only twice her family from Germany. So she has to outsource these care duties. And the daughter doesn't really need formal help, but she has a job and she has also different helps. Like, for example, she is sent by the partner to the grandmother every weekend and during holidays and also Christmas. But the neighborhood and friends give assistance to her. So we can see this egalitarian setting in the family, but also there is a conflict that the demented mother of Luca has to live in a nursing home, and the question is around the filial support, because the brother of Luca doesn't want to pay, as he says that you work abroad, and the sister, and that's why it's a question, an open question. So these were just two examples, but maybe they illustrated somehow certain points. And I want to sum up that I argue why policies and the welfare services play an important role in the daily practices of care. We can take into consideration biographical elements and gender norms of the individuals when we talk about the micromobilities of care. The empirical data show that individuals are aware of the available public services around their localities, but somehow they either lack trust or the traditional gender values, especially among certain groups, doesn't let them to take these services. We can see that among care migrants, there is at least one trustworthy helper in the country of origin, and that's how care duties can be outsourced. But in most cases, this doesn't mean professional caregiver, which can be afforded only by the higher status households. The growing demand on the elder care and the shortcomings of the institutional social care system are striking and challenges care receivers, care providers, and policymakers. The fieldwork indicates that capacities are uneven regardless of the size of the locality, which can stem from the insufficient number of workers, the lack of infrastructure and availability, and the absence of information among the concerned people, and also the costs of the provision. For example, none of the respondents applied for home care assistance service in the municipality, which is a small help, but on the other hand, it could be very useful. The Hungarian elder care policy is not able to bring together demands and the care capacity, which causes problems both to caregivers and the providers. And we also saw that gender norms are closely connected to decisions about using these services. Thank you.
Thank you, Dóra. Thank you. We will move to the final presentation. So I will, Attila, you are next.
Okay, here it is. So welcome everybody. I think we have already got an amazingly insightful picture about care, migration, care crisis in the whole region. But the region is famous about not only this, it is famous about also becoming a hotspot of anti-migrant populism. And then I think it's for us scholars working in a Polanyian framework is to try to understand this and then to reflect upon this And in the end, I would like to provoke some common Polanyian arguments concerning why authoritarian rule, or even some kind of a neo-fascism, how it can come into hegemony or can come into being. So the first and most important thing is the following, that Karl Polanyi in 1945 made a very important remark. He argued in a fantastic piece on regional planning or universal capitalism. He argued that in case in Eastern Europe, free market economy is introduced, that would lead to crazy nationalism. This prediction actually became true in two ways. One, first of all, free market utopia was introduced in the 1990s, and now we have crazy nationalisms. So in that sense, we are proving the point of Karl Polanyi. And in that sense, there are a lot of scholars who are working in the same way, who argue very nicely that the current wave of new nationalism, even among the working class, is very much related to this marketization wave. Here are some names whom you all know. I don't want to go into this in details. The problem is the following, at least my problem, is that the connecting mechanisms are debated and somewhat unexplored. That is to say, there is a big claim that there is this macro link between the two things, but what is the mechanism of that? What is the historical, material connection between these things and how this comes into being? And I think that this needs a lot of work. The work has already been started. Actually, some of the points which my distinguished friends and colleagues just made in this panel are amazingly good in this. Let's say care workers going from Hungary to Austria, they would like to see their welfare services protected as opposed to refugees coming into Austria. So that's crystal clear, and then we know a lot of things, but I think we need to go into some details here. I make two assumptions here. One is that there is an interplay between historical structures and discourses, and the other assumption, which is coming from a very good study of Dencier, is that there is a migration conflict when there is a very strict sense of competition for resources. So here is the kind of a logic I am doing. Actually, I'm trying to put together a huge piece now, from which I'm going to show little parts now, but this is the overall logic of this. It's a very Polanyian in the sense that opening up to globalization since the 80s, this leads to market changes, this leads to disembeddedness and uprootedness, this leads to increasing emigration rates, and there is a specific demographic development, which we need to understand the exact mechanisms of that, what is the role of state, capital, and market in this process. And then nationalism is understood by my study as well as a counter movement but it's very important. It's a counter movement in the given historical discursive space, because this is how meaning is attached to these changes, very much related to migratory population developmental patterns and the opening up of the economies, right? So that's the way how I think we can argue, but we will see this. Now, I come to a very shocking result, which I just created a couple of days ago. So I am still mesmerized by this. So in case you look at the world value surveys, then you can actually establish a time series, how anti-migrant feelings have been changing globally. From the 1990s to the 2010s. And then I made this. It's not so easy, but I don't want to go into details how you can do it. Then I looked at 60 countries where I could find the data for the 1990s and then later for the 2010s. And then I could see how the overall thing is changing. Now, there's one thing which is very surprising. Actual actually the overall anti-migrant attitude as measured by a neighborhood question is not really going up globally. So in that sense, we would say, come on, the argument is not okay. But I think this is not correct. I think we have to look at in details somehow. What is most important here is that I found basically two types of regions globally. One is the West, and then the other is Latin America, which are more tolerant, at least concerning this attitude measurement. That is to say that they are more open, living together with migrants. And actually, you can see the yellow and the blue column. There you can see it, that they are relatively open, and this relative openness is actually going down a little bit, but remains more or less the same. Asia is massively not so tolerant, relatively speaking. So there are countries which massively say, in 35% respondents say they don't want to live with any kind of a foreign worker or migrant. And that's very important. And then there is Africa, where there is actually somewhat a decline in this respect, which is also very interesting, and we have to think about this. But for me, and that was actually something I was not happy about, but as a researcher, I was happy because this is what I was expecting. Eastern Europe is the only region where it is actually massively going up. And then, you know, it's very surprising why Eastern Europe is doing this, because Eastern Europe is not having so many immigrants. So how is that possible? Why is it that way? Now, one more thing I would like to just make for further debate, why Latin America and the West are open and the others are not. I think it's a long-term historical thing, very much related to colonialism. Colonialism broke down, state borders broke down, created all kinds of migratory channels, made integrated imperialist set of structures, and then even the post-colonial period was more integrated in that. And then this is why I think it's as opposed to Asian, East European societies, which were peasant societies and had longer-term statehood formations, right? Rather stable ones in that sense. But let's not go into the details. The most important point here is that this Eastern Europe nationalism versus globalization as related to migration story is an East European story in some ways, most importantly. Now let's go into some details. Now this doesn't mean, and this is very important, that there is not a massive difference between these countries in Eastern Europe. Some countries are extremely anxious, some countries are much more open. So how is, Hungary coming together with Albania? In Hungary, 40% of the people, according to this average, always said they never wanted to live with with a migrant or a foreign worker, or the Czech Republic is also in that. And then Albania and Poland, very interestingly, they're on the other side. And before we go into betting, why is it so? I think it's very important to do some analysis, and I'm trying to, basically my talk is going to be, is the following argument. Yes, neoliberalism leads to this counter movement of nationalism and anti-migrant populism, but the historical patterns matter a lot, and actually it can explain a lot of things. Now, what is this East European syndrome? State, capital, and social redistribution. Now, one thing, as a historical material background, increasing emigration from the region is definitely linked to globalization. We could model globally, and then we could see, especially that worked for Eastern Europe, if foreign capital intrudes into economies and societies, then it is uprooting people, and then it is sending out people. So we have a very strong empirical proof of that. Now, this is happening in a region where there is a massive depopulation and the care crisis. And then I can see that maybe I need 7. Okay. And then this is in the meantime of with low immigration and an unequal exchange. I show you 2 graphs now very quickly. Don't be mesmerized by this. The only thing what you have to look at here is the following. This is, emigration and the intrusion of global capital into local economies globally. This is the global. Eastern Europe is the most globalized region on Earth in terms of openness to foreign capital. So why are we surprised in some ways that this is going to be the most nationalistic one as well, in that sense, because they have such open economies? Here are the things what my colleagues were talking about. At the same time, globalization, this is the EU tax revenue and social contribution as a percentage of GDP. You can see that even EU, there is a decline and stagnation. Globalization, regardless of aging, regardless of the massive social changes, redistribution rates are stagnating or going down. In Eastern Europe, the situation is much worse. Actually, there is an overall decline, which makes our point extremely important concerning that there is something going on. Okay. Now, sorry, and this is how we go. And then here is the depopulation. Don't go into details in this graph. 1990 is 100%. Now, this is the population development before 1990 in socialist mixed economies, and this is population development afterwards. There's no need to explain it. This is a region which, according to the UN, is most hit by depopulation and which is going to face dramatic problems of aging, care, depopulation, and so on. When at the same time, it is also leading to massive outmigration. And here are the different groups. And now I focus on just 2 groups, one which I call Central Europe, and the other one is emigrant Eastern Europe, right? So these 2 groups. So the first one is Czechia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Slovakia. The other one is Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Poland, Romania, and Serbia, right? These are the ones. Now, what is important here, that as opposed to the emigrant Eastern Europe, Central Europe is sending much less. So Central Europe actually is offering more opportunity for people to stay at home as compared to other countries in terms of relatively speaking. Nonetheless, this is much more anxious about the immigration than the actually big emigrant countries like Poland, right? So there's something to think about this. Now, here is one solution for this problem in this longer term development. One is that in terms of immigration rates, I mean, here we can actually exclude ex-Yugoslavia from this, but look at just these things. So the Central European countries, relatively speaking, got more immigration, and they got immigration in the beginning, right? In the 1990s, when the labor markets were collapsing because of globalization, while the other countries are not. Even more, we know sociologically that immigrants coming into Central Europe are actually are really competing with the local population because they are very well educated and rather well integrated into the in the labor market, which is actually has caused a lot of headache for some sociologists to understand this, why is this happening. Now here is the first type. Central Europe is amazingly open, much more open than the other one, the East European emigrant version. And then you can also see that regardless of being more open, emigration is less in the Central European part than it is actually in the other part. Now, in case you go and look at, here is something very tricky. In case you look at OECD, in case you look at tax revenues and social contribution as a percentage of GDP, these countries of Central Europe are the ones which are actually trying to maintain some welfare system. So as opposed to emigrant neoliberal Eastern Europe, they were the ones who were actually trying to maintain some protection. So once again, there is a paradox. How is that those who are trying to provide more social redistribution are the ones who are more anxious? Okay, and then we have to think about this, right? Because in case you look at the other countries are actually below EU average, and they are actually giving much less social redistribution. So how is it that Romania is more tolerant, sending more people out, having a bigger depopulation, and at the same time being more open in this respect, according to the data I've been providing? Now, and I come to concluding because I see Chadley is looking at me anxiously that I have to finish, although I could continue it for another hour because I think for me, it's so tantalizing and I would like to see your comments. So the point I wanted to make is that the globalization and nationalism links are found through migration and contradictions around migration, in the sense it is found in the following way. Eastern Europe is super anxious because it's depopulating. It is uprooted. It is losing population in terms of emigration massively. It is afraid that there is an enormous demographic fragility here. And then these nation states, these linguistic communities are becoming extremely anxious that they lose control over their own countries, right? Also, crystal clearly, the whole region is won by foreign capital. It is dominated. They won over local states and societies. And then that's it. Now, that's actually one of the reasons that some of the elites are trying to use animosity to get into power, animosity against this too big globalization of Eastern Europe, right? But we have to put the East European syndrome into a specific historical and material demographic situation. Not only generally as an unequal exchange, but paying attention to one thing. And then here we come back to one of the biggest preoccupations of Karl Polanyi, the rise of authoritarian rule, the rise of nationalism. That Central Europe is more anxious about these developments because, first of all, they have something to defend in terms of privileges. They were the better off economies under the socialist regime. During the transition, they were not experiencing any kinds of a cataclysmic problem like in Poland, like in Romania, and in many other countries. And then these societies are in a constant tension that they are trying to maintain privileges. So authoritarian rule is more coming out of such societies which have some memory of some very good periods which they are trying to defend. It's a much more dangerous mix than immigrant countries which actually experienced a dramatic cataclysm in the 1980s. Think about Romania and Poland, food shortages, enormous collapse of the economy. Albania also, I mean, it was really going down in that period. For them, the globalization period, yes, it was uprooting, but at the same time, they started climbing back. So in case you look at the relative figures, then these economies and countries were actually going up while Central Europe was basically stagnating overall. Nonetheless, and this is my last thing, nonetheless, these two groups are very different sociologically, but in the end, they made an alliance in terms of defending Europe against non-Europeans because they share the Eurocentric things. So here, when they come together, because Romanian immigrants are also afraid of competing other migrants within the European Union because they would like to monopolize that region for themselves. And then this is the way how they come to the more anxious populations of Central Europe. And then this is how this new, as some people put it, coalition of the ugly appears now in Europe. And with this, I am finished and I have concluded. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Attila. Thank you. So we have 15, 20 minutes for a conversation, an exchange. I see maybe we can all come back live. I mean, so we're all seeing ourselves.
Yes.
Okay, super. Okay, so Thank you for all of the presentations, focusing maybe on the care migration, but also with this global perspective of a region, of the diversity of the region. Also, when looking at each of the historical situation, demographic situation, it's quite interesting. In the Q&A, I see one question. Feel free also if you have any questions or comments, we'll start maybe by the questions. I will read it. It's a broad question. I think it relates to most of your work. Maybe I'll read it. I have to read it for the audience. Commuting live-in workers were taken as a potential threat, like we heard. The same was in my country of origin, the person who's asking the question, Slovakia. I completely understand that it was hard for commuters to cope with stigmatization during COVID-19. What would you say that are the solutions during these hard times? Because commuting means moving, crossing the borders, migrating, which is risky during pandemics. Anyone wants to jump on this? Is there any?
If I can,
yes.
Do you hear me? Yeah, I'm originally from Slovakia, so I can relate to this question as well. I think, of course, vaccination is going to help. What I know from Slovakia now, people 40 plus are getting vaccination. So this is the demographic group of Slovak, for example, caregivers in Austria. But in fact, or what we can say that all this group was kind of left behind, because states, their priority was to vaccinate either in Austria or in Germany, those who are working in formal institutions as a staff, but those working in private households, they were left behind. And of course, what I observed in the field, they were lacking any kind of information at the beginning of pandemic. Nobody spoke about, for example, safety equipments for them, providing them when we compare it with the situation of formal workers. So I was also surprised how many of them are not recognizing caregivers COVID as a problem. They strongly believe in conspiracy theories, but it's related what Attila explained. They feel left behind by state, so that's why they had to leave their families. They have to migrate. They have to work in precarious working conditions in live-in service in other EU country, which is supposed to be our partner, not someone who is using our cheap labor. So I was deeply surprised how they believe in those conspiracies. And perhaps I would like to add one more point here to Attila's presentation. Perhaps from outside, it could be seen that those caregivers from Central and Eastern Europe are in one homogenic group. That they are creating kind of sisterhood towards those Westerns, but it's not the truth, of course. There are really power hierarchies. There are the privileged one, for example, Czech caregivers, Slovak caregivers, or Polish caregivers, and they are somehow having strong tensions towards, for example, caregivers from Romania or Bulgaria, taking their jobs for cheaper wages and salaries. So just to break this picture of homogeneous region even more. So it's from me.
Yes.
If I may, I would just have a quick comment and then question for Attila. So of course, mobility and movement may be risky in the era of pandemic, but at the same time, I think the political borders or the geographic borders are not something which can be just taken for granted as a measure to stop the spread of the virus, and the virus is just spreading across the border. So I think that, and it also, like the first reaction of closing the borders was actually trying to solve a global problem, health problem, with old measures, which was not necessarily the most effective strategy. But So this is just my quick reaction, and I would like to add something to, or ask something in reaction to Attila's presentation. You mentioned, Attila, that nationalism, that you see nationalism as the counter movement against the neoliberal globalization brought to the region mainly in the 90s and onwards. But I was thinking that it is actually more complicated, because some, well, you know, it is actually what we try to explain in our presentation, that it is this nationalism combined with globalization, which in fact keeps going the marketization of not only care, but also, you know, other spheres of social life. So it is actually nationalism at a level of only discursive strategy, but in a, you know, material sense, it is not, you know, it is not really realized, or the politics. I mean, even now, the national reactions to the pandemic, it is a global process. It is a global trend. It is not a national strategy. So maybe I misunderstood this, but I think it's actually like discursive nationalism, not really the political one or materialized one, if I may to put it that way. I was wondering, what do you think about that?
Go ahead.
Yes, I could not agree more with Zuzana what you are saying, and what Petra is also referring to, because because we have to. I could not continue. So of course it's a counter movement. That is to say, it gets social support. So you have to ask the question why they support this, and then you also have to ask the question: is that what is, you know, the role of the elite in this, and how they manipulate the whole story, which is super important. I think, you know, there is a long debate in Polanyian circles whether nationalism is a counter movement or not. I think it is a counter movement, but in a real sense, it is not leading out of the contradictions which give birth to it, right? Meaning that it is actually, in plain words, it leads to societies to the wall in that sense, because they utilize this counter-movement feeling and attitudes and absolute frustration of the population with the whole story. But they are not giving any viable answer to that. And even more, as you pointed out, they allow and even sometimes promote the marketization, but under their own controls. It's a new type of a management of the previous neoliberal things. Nonetheless, it's not the same as in the previous period, because then we are mistaken. So in that sense, it's, you know, it's a classic problem. That is to say, a lot of people would like to say that authoritarian rule is not the same as, you know, as a marketized system. It is another type of marketized system. So I agree with this. It doesn't lead out of the contradictions, and this is it. The point I was trying to make was the following, which tantalizes me a little bit, is these internal hierarchies within the whole region. So how is it possible that the emigrant Eastern Europe, as opposed to the Central European region, why is it showing less of an anxiety in terms of migration issues, when actually there would be arguments they should be really worried about this? And then I think it leads to the question of the experience of this massive out-migration in a specific historical moment. And I think this is what I think we should now add to the Polanyian literature. We East European or scholars working on Eastern Europe, that there's something very important to put to the original Polanyian studies, right? So I think that's very important. And this makes what you are doing in these ethnographic, anthropological, sociological work, it gives an enormous importance to your work, because this work is going to give an answer to this, that how these paradoxes can be actually solved.
Great. I have another question from the Q&A, so I will read it to all speakers. it's interesting. You'll see, because it brings a global perspective to what the care migration situation is in Eastern Europe or Central Europe. How is the relation between these care workers from Central Eastern Europe with those from the global South? Is there any hope of a joint organization for resistance? And maybe a follow-up, what is the role of the hiring agencies for the recruitment of care workers in Central Eastern Europe? For example, if we take the Philippines, I know from the Canadian perspective, it's huge. What do you see here? Do they play a crucial role? And finally, there's a little end question to Attila specifically. Do you think Trump defeat will mean something, or will have an impact on the rise of nationalism and far-right movements in Central Eastern Europe? So maybe the first one, if anyone wants to react to the question of maybe resistance or civil society, which was something I had in mind too. What do you have in these countries, organization defending the care workers, wanting them to have better conditions? Even in Canada, I would say finally there is a discourse or a need to have them change their migrant status from temporary to permanent residence. I mean, this is what is happening here, but from the
but this is not the case in our region, because most of our women or most of our countries are in EU. They don't need to deal with the status. Yeah, this is the case. But I think this is something what is connected to the history. I think people just need to relearn to organize themselves, you know, and to fight for their labor rights, perhaps. I don't know. But what we saw definitely during the pandemic situation, that it started as grassroots movements. What I know that some women, for example, from Romania, they started their activities, resistance activities, and organizing themselves in Austria. Or what I heard, the same happened in Poland, that they have created a special association of migrant care workers. But I think also what is important is the role of trade unions here, because there are, I think it was till now their long-term strategy to not to include migrant care work or migrants in their structures, but for example, in the case of the Czech Republic, their association Alice, the new one, trade union focusing on care workers, is now trying to open the discussion towards organizing or involving more care workers. But the problem is that they are still speaking about formal care workers working in institutional facilities. So nobody is speaking here about those working in a live-in services. So what plays even more crucial role in the organization or support is that are online platforms of those care workers. So they are sharing their experiences, you know, supporting each other, but also sharing the conspiracies, etc. So, you know, it has this kind of double effect there. So I think those platforms are much more important now for them for speaking up.
I have Noémi also. Maybe you want to add something?
Yeah, just a little bit, just continuing also what Petra was saying, that I wouldn't say there is no joint organization for resistance. There are also several, so there are attempts and also organizations including migrant workers from different countries. There's also a question how successful they are and how far like the different caregivers are represented. But also and also trade unions, that's true. I mean, they're also what I wanted to say, that they're a really important actor, but it's also like a question is different. I mean, it's different in different countries whether caregivers can become members of trade unions at all. So it's also, for example, in the case of Hungary, if since it's a mainly black market, caregivers do not have the chance to become members of trade unions. So, but there are also on the European level advocacy, advocacy actions and policy papers written jointly by organizations like PICOM, which really defends or represent the interest of undocumented workers. So they also started or like work more and more on the case of living care workers, for instance.
Yeah,
but
European
also,
level is much more developed than the local one.
Yeah.
It was my argument.
Yeah. Sorry, that's right. And also, like what I knew or heard that, like also for trade unions, it's been it's also like partly hard. It's not. Yeah, that's true that the strategy was also like not to work that much on migrants, but also, especially living care workers are also harder to reach. So also that's why also what you were saying, that like informal groups, self-organizations play a really crucial role, and probably like a good strategy is like a cooperation between the different actors like trade unions, NGOs, and the self-organizations. So also that's what we could see in Switzerland, for example, where really like the local self-organizations became supported by trade unions. So it's a kind of the cooperation between various actors is definitely helpful.
Okay, maybe no one else?
Yes.
Just because we have a few minutes left, so maybe.
I would like to answer the two questions. So one is coming from Patricia.
Yes, Patricia.
Which is an excellent question, and then there's a question from Pavlina as well.
Yes, I just saw that too.
And then I try to answer them one by one because we have just basically 2 minutes left, I think. One is that the collapse of the Trump administration. Yes. On the one hand, of course, the right-wing governments in Europe, they are sorry because of that, because they don't have an ally to fight against Brussels with, so together, right? So in that sense, there are problems, but there's one rule in politics. Sometimes you lose something, but they get a more clear enemy now, which means now they can show that here is the incompetent liberal US, which is causing a lot of trouble. So in that sense, I think they are not too unhappy about the whole story. The other point I would like to make concerning this, I don't want to go into speculations, but I am, as far as I can see, that the global political situation is deteriorating actually in terms of, this anti-Russia, anti-China debate is actually boiling up dramatically. And in that sense, you see all kinds of conflicts are good for right-wing governments because, first of all, there's no energy to deal them with. The second is that they can always, fishing in the murky waters, it's always a good for them. That would be my second thing, but the question is just too good to answer it, right? One more thing I wanted to say concerning my talk as well, don't misunderstand me. In Poland, we also have a nationalist government, but not based on migration. That was the point, okay? So do not misunderstand me. They found LGBTQ as the arch enemy, and then this is what they are doing, right? Which is absolutely related to the topic what we have been talking about in our debate. Okay, the other question which is concerning is that whether what is the imagination in Eastern Europe concerning this, and then the Slovakia. Once again, there are differences. I'm not saying that in Romania and in Poland you don't find such groups. For instance, we know it from opinion polls. The Hungarian minority in Romania is more intolerant than even the Hungarian public, right? But it's a minority. That's the point. So even there is an ethnic division here, right? So once again, don't misunderstand me that you don't find such groups there. Overall, that's the picture. That Czech Republic, Hungary, very important. I didn't talk about Estonia, which is another one. So Estonia, Czech Republic, Hungary, these are the super anti-migrant all the time, right? But once again, it needs analysis, but I could come back to this, but in 50 minutes, impossible. Second, what Pavlina is pointing to is absolutely vital. Petra was also referring to this hierarchical imagination. That is to say, we Slovakian migrants, we are not migrants. We are EU citizens. We are just practicing our normal rights. Migrants are those who are everybody else, right? So that's the way how they try to solve it. So these hierarchies and competition together, this is actually the sociological hotbed of the whole thing, right? So this is actually what is giving its dynamic, and it's an awful dynamic. So we critical sociologists, we can only say, repeat, we are not with anybody in this hierarchy. We are against hierarchy, right? I think that's the most important, you know. So as soon as we have a global economic system which is less based on in hierarchy, we are going to live in a much better world, right? Up till that point, everything ugly can come out of this hierarchy competition hell.
Great. Well, I see the time is flying, too bad, but I think we had a great panel. Sorry for there was some glitch, technology glitch, but it happens. And I think we all had a good sense of the work you're doing. So thank you. Just maybe I was invited just to share that there's a conference on non-capitalist mixed economy organized by the Polanyi Research Center for Global Studies in June. It's a Zoom. It's on Zoom. So, but
yeah,
it's
everything will be on Zoom. And then in case you are interested, please contact us. In case you look at Polanyi Research Center, contact us, and then we are going to share all the information with you. Of course, this is going to be a super Polanyian conference in the sense of the idea of mixed economies, right? In a non-capitalist framework.
Yeah.
Very importantly. Okay.
Great. Merci tout le monde. Thank you. And I think that's it. We're leaving this platform. Au revoir.
Thank you very much. Au
Thank
revoir.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.